Hello, hello. Dave Ford here, SoulBuffalo Earth Report, Thursday afternoon. Super excited. This is episode 16, and we have Nick Mallos from the Ocean Conservancy and the Trash Free Seas Alliance. How you doing, man?
I'm doing quite well. How are you?
I am good. I guess all things considered, definitely a crazy time to be alive, crazy year. The last time you and I saw each other was February.
It was in Phoenix. It was a little warmer than it is here in Portland, Oregon, a little sunnier. But we were still talking the same thing. We were talking waste, trash, plastics, all of the above.
And you were at Footprints. I think you were down there with Foot. I was there for Green Biz and Waste Management's Phoenix Open. You were there for Footprint. Footprint's amazing, actually. We've gotten to know some of those guys.
They're a great group of guys, gals, all of the above, doing really innovative work, great perspective on things, and just, really contributing in a positive way to thinking about what the whole universe of material innovation can look like in packaging. So yeah, really, really great group of folks.
Yeah, they're killing it right now. I mean, their core main product replaces plastic meat trays. So, correct?
Correct. One of many products they're doing, but yes, definitely finding alternative, compostables, fully disposable manners to replace some of the harder to recycle plastics that are being used in meat and other types of packaging applications.
Super cool. February seems like a million years ago, but it's good to be here.
Yeah.
In mid-November. Looks like we know who the next president's going to be, so that is definitely should be a really good thing for the environment as things play out here. But let me ask you a couple questions, Nick. No, so you are absolutely. I feel like your Twitter feed is so valuable for us over here, and that I consistently get gold in your Twitter feed. You guys check out Nick's Twitter feed if you have not already. But you guys put out a huge report, squarely centered on the U.S.'s really responsibility and role with respect to the plastic waste issue. Can you tell us a little bit about it? It came out last week with the rock stars, the luminaries of plastic waste research.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're far too kind, and I would say disclaimer: don't get your hopes up on my Twitter feed, but I appreciate the kind words. But yeah, the study. So on October 30th, in Science Advances, Law et al., we were fortunate to publish a new study that really reevaluates the United States' role in the global ocean plastic waste equation. And this study is kind of the culmination of a year-long analysis we've been working on. And so Dr. Kara Lavender Law was the lead author on the study, along with our colleagues, Dr. Jenna Jambeck at University of Georgia, and then Ted Siegler and Natalie Starr, waste management experts from DSM Environmental Consulting, and then my colleague Dr. George Leonard at OC, who's our chief scientist, and then myself. And so we've spent the last year really analyzing this, and the study itself was motivated by the results of Jenna's 2015 paper, Jambeck et al., published in Science, that gave that canonical value of 8 million metric tons of plastics entering the ocean annually, and really highlighting
right. It's like the Jambeck paper. When people talk about that in this space, it's like one of the defining moments of last.
Yeah, it's kind of like, even though this has been an issue for a long time, it's kind of like the reference point, the baseline from which a lot of people have talked about the issue over the last 5 years. And that study looked at population, plastic waste generation, proximity to coastal environments, but we knew it overlooked some really important factors that we just weren't able to capture. And that was things like the fact the United States, the EU, are some of the largest plastic waste generators in the world. And a lot of that material flows around the world through exports and other means that just wasn't represented in that study. So we just took a deeper dive on those types of export data. We took a deeper dive and found new information on illegal dumping rates in the United States, because we know that exists, but it wasn't accounted for in Jambeck. And so really it was just a next iteration in our understanding and knowledge on this issue. And the one thing I would say, I was chatting with you earlier, Dave, like Jambeck should not have been considered the end all be all, publication on this issue. This publication also just refines our knowledge. It is not the end all be all on the issue of ocean plastics and plastic waste, but rather a further refinement and kind of elucidation on the roles and responsibilities of the United States and other countries more broadly.
So after all this hard work and after putting this out, what is your like core takeaways about the US's responsibility based on your findings?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the core of all this, we should look at the fact that United States is about 4% of the world's population, and we generate about 17% of its plastic waste. To put those numbers into perspective, in 2016, the amount of mismanaged plastic waste in the United States piled high would cover the entire White House lawn as tall as the Empire State Building. So a huge amount of plastic waste and subsequently mismanaged waste is generated from the United States. But as we've seen over the last few months, we've seen other publications. Yanni from Systemic talked on Tuesday about the breaking the wave analysis. My colleagues and I, Burrell et al., published another study in Science in September that looks at the ambitious needs we have to really increase reduction efforts, really increase management efforts, and continue to increase cleanup efforts to get a handle on this issue globally over the next decade. And so what our study shows, this US analysis, is that by focusing on efforts here at home to really reduce unnecessary plastic like bags and straws and foam, and also putting in place more aggressive recycling systems, creating recycled markets, by doing those things here at home, we're not only addressing the issue within our borders, but we know it has cascading effects because so much of our waste has been exported overseas for the last 3 decades.
It's interesting too, and we talked about this a little bit before, and what we did, you guys have done a ton of work on COVID-19. We had Keith Harrison from the Recycling Partnership on last week. I'm from Baltimore, and she told me that Baltimore paused their recycling. It's a major U.S. city. It's happening all over the country. It's happening all over the world. A lot of the data, like from the Breaking the Plastic Wave report that Yanni talked about on the show Tuesday, doesn't reflect any COVID implications. So we'd love to. I know that you guys have been really diving deep there. What are some of the findings that you guys are coming across of recent?
Well, I mean, data is continuing to pour out on that. So we know a couple months ago, the Science published estimated roughly 200 billion with a B items of PPE are being used monthly around the world during this pandemic. And we know the majority of PPE is made of plastic that is not recyclable. And so certainly when we think about responsible use of plastics, personal protective equipment is an important use, right? There are reusable masks, you can go that route, but at the end of the day, human health has to be paramount during this time of pandemic. And so PPE is an important use. We don't know if certainly not all of that PPE is going to find its way into the environment. We know some of it will. And in the early stages, we were seeing tweets, we were seeing media stories of pictures of masks and gloves on beaches and waterways in the ocean. But we're starting to get a better sense that there is a fairly, evident presence of this stuff leaking into the environment. I'm here in Portland, Oregon. I walk around the streets, I take hikes. I see more masks and gloves, than I ever have before. And it is something that is noticeable because in general, our streets, our trails are pretty clean. And so we are seeing this uptick. And during this year's International Coastal Cleanup, Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup, the data are still very, very preliminary. But just initial data coming in, we've already seen more than 70,000 items of PPE documented on beaches and waterways around the world in more than 90 countries. So we know it is increasing. We know it is something that is probably here to stay for some time. And we just have to think about how that factors in and exacerbates really what is already a global crisis around plastics threatening our environment and ecosystems.
It's interesting too, because, I think a lot of the just Southeast Asia, I mean, one of the big things of your report that maybe like to kind of like bring the thread together, there's a tremendous amount of waste that is leaking into the ocean, specifically from these like 5 countries in Southeast Asia. And I think like a lot of the onus and responsibility is sort of just like, Laura Parker from National Geographic wrote this article in response to your report that came out, and she reached out to me to try to figure out, is this really, being portrayed as an Asian problem and not a US problem? And you look at the masks that are going into the system in Asia, and you've seen a lot of pictures. I've seen a lot like of just, a lot of the PPE getting in over there in a much more alarming rate, which would make sense if more of the plastic waste is getting in there. But I mean, I'm on calls with heads of sustainability in the US regularly where plastic waste in the oceans is not an issue because it's not a kind of US problem. And I feel like what you guys just put out, I think is really, is really helping to sort of dispel that myth in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, again, I think over the last 5 years in the wake of Jamback and throughout now, I think there is a strong desire to make this like a very binary issue. It's either all of their fault or all of their fault or our fault, and it's not. It's complex. This is a global issue. Everyone is part of this issue, and everyone needs to be part of this solution. It is true that there are still large inputs of plastics going into the ocean, not only in 5 countries in Asia, but in a lot of developing economies around the world, where there is this fundamental mismatch between plastic waste that's being generated and the ability to manage it. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that in places like the United States, the EU collectively, we are the largest producers of plastic waste globally, far disproportionate to our population size. And for far too long, a large portion of that plastic waste has been exported to many of these countries that do not have the ability to manage it. And so, one, you can talk about where is the plastics actually entering the ocean, but at the end of the day, it's about a responsibility, accountability, who needs to be held accountable. And at the end of the day, we all do. But the United States over the last 5 years has largely been absent of kind of responsibility because so much focus has been on just a few number of countries. And so what this paper shows is that the US has an opportunity to lead even more in terms of putting in place solutions and policies that reduce our plastic footprint here at home, while also helping to reduce the burden on the ocean, on communities, and on many of these economies around the world.
Now, we work with a lot of waste management companies, a lot of individuals and leaders kind of in that sector as a part of what we're doing for obvious reasons. And, some of the feedback I heard about the paper specifically was just about the export data, and that it was 2016 export data. And we were at 2016. It's incredible how much waste we were sending overseas.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit and where we are now compared to where we were there?
Absolutely. And to put the context, so 2016 data was the second iteration of the World Bank report. The first World Bank report were the data that were used in that 2015 Jambeck paper. And so we used the next iteration, better data from World Bank, so that there was some apples to apples comparison of how things have evolved. But you're right, with the implementation of China's national sword, since 2016, we've seen exports of plastic waste from the US drop 66%. That's a huge amount. What is concerning about that is over the same period of time, we've seen waste generation increase in the United States, and we are seeing recycling decrease a little bit. And so all of that means we are having, a greater pileup of plastic waste and waste more broadly here in the United States. And because the recycling rates are decreasing, that means there's really 2 pathways where that waste is going. It is either being landfilled or it is either being burned in waste to energy plants or incineration. And so regardless of the ocean aside, neither of those pathways are great recipes for sustainable development, responsible material use, and kind of principles of circular economy. And so it's about getting a handle on kind of our plastics, our relationship with plastics here in the United States, using it responsibly, managing it responsibly, getting it back into the systems when it warrants it, but also thinking about policies that phase out some of those unnecessary products that are disproportionately impactful to the environment, are not readily recyclable, and we know suitable alternatives exist.
With this problem, like you mentioned, it just doesn't get more. I mean, it doesn't really get more complex to some degree. I mean, obviously, climate change is incredibly complex, and I don't think that you're going to get any argument that that's our most existential threat. But there's also these huge correlations between plastics and climate. I mean, when this stuff breaks down in landfills, even if it takes a really long time, there's a climate impact. When it gets burned, there's a climate impact. I guess what keeps you up at night the most about this issue? I mean, there's definitely I would say a handful of people that we've met since we've gotten really, really deep into this. You're one of them that is just, you've been working on this for 10 years. What would you say is maybe the biggest obstacle that we need to overcome in your mind?
I think at its core, it is, how do we decouple economic growth and development with plastic waste, increases in plastic waste and disposability? We have seen that in many instances, with emergence of wealth, emergences into middle class, high income societies, we see significant increases in the amount of plastic waste that is generated. And we know to date, plastic waste has deleterious effects on our environment. It has deleterious effects on, ocean dependent economies. And increasingly evidence supports that there's concerns around, the relationship between plastics, whether it's in the seafood, whether it's, being burned in developing economies, and human health. And so it really is, how do we get a handle on the growth trajectories that are presented on plastics in the future, when all data on the impacts and effects suggest we have to bend that curve? And so the growth is going like this. The science shows us we have to get the curve flattened, at best. And right now, the daylight between two is absolutely huge.
Right. It's just like just a massive, I think, and it's also, it speaks to, I think it's interesting when you start to dive into Paris Agreement and, this idea that it really does attack the fossil fuel economy to some degree. And like a lot of what came out of the Paris Agreement, even though I think a lot of people would agree it's not perfect with respect to climate, definitely is going to leave an impact on the fossil fuel sector, right? I mean, there's obviously like huge incentives to move to, alternative energy. Like, do you feel like something similar needs to happen specifically, just with the virgin plastic production here? I mean, I know it's so tricky because there's like a lot of research about how using plastic can be helpful from a climate perspective, shipping and otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. We have to acknowledge, right? Plastics is an amazing material, absolutely incredible material when it's used in appropriate applications and managed responsibly. But there is all science that shows in the recent studies that Yanni, and Pew and Systemic published, my colleagues that published a parallel study in the journal Science, all of those studies show that we need to drastically increase recycling and to also start bending the curve on virgin plastics production. And we know, right, I'm not a climate expert, but we do know that there are major climate wins and greenhouse gas wins if you increase recycling and generate more recycled content in products, right? Virgin plastics production all the way through disposal, right, has a greater climate impact than if you can get the recycling piece fixed. So I think we need to think about this. Yes, there's the climate issue. Yes, there's a plastics issue. There's a lot of overlap where they are interconnected, and solving aspects of one has huge benefits and solves issues of the other. And then at the same time, I lost my train of thought here. I was thinking of something and then I went on to the climate piece. It'll come back to me. But yeah, I mean, we can't think of these things as two disconnected issues. They are connected, and they have solving, aspects of one has huge dividends for the other.
What do you think, with respect to the consumer and like the gap on consumer sort of understanding? I mean, if you think of like, there's so many different solution sets, but it's, consciousness just around what we're using and what you're buying. Like, what do you think are some of the most exciting things that you've seen out there to affect and maybe now's a really good time to talk about the cleanup that you guys do every year, which is incredible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think with respect to the consumer, I think one of the real challenges right now is it's hard to be a consumer. There are so many choices in front of us, so many labels, so many mixed messages, and oftentimes, consumers may think they are making the right decision by purchasing something made of bioplastics or something that's made of compostables, but then their local systems, can't actually handle those materials, and so it really doesn't have a net benefit on the environment the way they thought they were. So we need to think about, how do we make materials, how do we design materials, how do we have the systems matching materials so that it is easier on the consumer and that we are taking the hard choices out of their hands. And that really also goes to using materials that are highly recyclable, having the systems that can deal with, the high value materials, and putting in place recycled content standards so that we are creating the markets to pull recycled materials through the system. At the same time, you talk about the International Coastal Cleanup. Ocean Conservancy has been privileged to mobilize that effort for the last 35 years, bring volunteers on beaches and waterways around the world through our partners in all those countries. So we couldn't do it without the partners and our partner NGO organizations in more than 100 countries around the world. But that's a one effort. And often I'd say, in addition to the value of the cleanup changing awareness, and really for many people presenting them, front and center the issue for the first time, they think they have a clean beach, they go out and they do the cleanup, and all of a sudden they see how much plastic is actually on their local beach. It does change their mind. It creates a mind shift and makes them aware and greater awareness as a consumer moving forward. But we also know now that the new science has emerged that shows that cleanup has to be part of the equation, that even if we do everything right in terms of reduction and management, we still need to clean up. And that's not just on the backs of volunteers. We need to think about how do we better kind of institutionalize cleanups, significantly increase the amount of debris we are removing from important ocean habitats, and think about the role of things like waterway infrastructures, Mr. Water Wheel in Baltimore, and other devices that can capture large amounts of debris and trash before it enters into those environments where it becomes almost impossible to clean up.
Mr. Water Wheel is like one of my absolute favorites. It's like another reason why it's like extra special heartbreaking that they stopped recycling or momentarily paused in Baltimore. But for those that don't know Mr. Water Wheel, another amazing Twitter account, but these water wheels that are adjacent around the harbor in Baltimore, and they just slowly collect trash and all kinds of other crazy stuff that's floating down the water. Also, like, I think it's pretty interesting. Ocean cleanups pivot into waterways, I think, has been really interesting as well. TerraCycle also, the TerraCycle Foundation is doing waterway cleanups. And I mean, there's been studies that have come out that if you get the plastic in the rivers, as opposed to when it gets out into the ocean, it's less contaminated and that you can be used and recycled easier. So yeah, it's like kind of so many different aspects of this, but I would totally agree. How much plastic waste did you guys get this year with international cleanup?
Data is still very preliminary, and obviously with COVID, there's the entire cleanup looked very different, but still many of our partners around the world, incredible organizations, still mobilizing people in safe, socially distanced manners. So the data are still coming in. But, over the course of those 3 decades that the ICC has existed, we were seeing almost 400 million pounds of debris being collected. But that barely scratches the surface when we think about what we need. And so we're thinking about ways of how do we amplify, the global efforts through cleanups like the ICC? How do we continue to mobilize and work with partners to scale these efforts throughout the year? And how do we think about some of these high impact geographies where we know there's major river pathways that carry large volumes of waste, and think about the systems you can put in those rivers before the debris has the chance to go into the ocean, where it disperses and again becomes pretty much impossible to clean up. So cleanup is still a critical piece of the puzzle, but it's only a critical piece of the puzzle if it's also combined with the upstream reduction and management solutions that we know are absolutely critical.
So here's more of a sort of a softer question that I try to ask everyone. If you had to pick a time if you had to pick a environmental superhero of yours that you'd like to spend a day with or sit down and get to know, who'd you pick?
Sorry, you cut out there for 1 second. Can you ask that one more time?
I said, if you had to pick an environmental superhero that you could spend a half a day with or get to know that you don't already know, who would you pick?
Oh man. Well, it would defy the laws of biology, but I would probably say Rachel Carson, actually. The awareness and the change in mentality that her publications and her research had on kind of environmentalism writ large, and really was the early stages of making it a movement that now is embedded into every aspect and every part of our life. I think that is, on the short list of folks that I would love to just have a conversation with, especially given it was deemed so radical at the time. It was groundbreaking, gender, across the board, a true rock star, and really the foundation of environmentalism as we know it.
Can you give a little bit more just on her background in general for folks who might not know? Can you hear me, Nick?
I'm sorry, you cut out there again, Dave.
Yeah, no worries. I said, can you just give a little bit more background on her bio a little bit?
Silent Spring was one of her, most famous publications, and it really raised awareness around the linkages between pesticides and how the cascading effects and accumulation throughout the ecosystem can happen, and how, eggs from birds the shells were becoming softer and mortality rates were increasing because of the transfer of pollutants over decades, have these lingering effects. And it's not, out of sight, out of mind, but there's real lingering environmental effects on our environment that is not just bad for the environment, that is not just bad for the animals that live there, but has implications and potential risks to humans and society as we know it. So again, really just showed the fact that we are all interconnected. There is no environment without humans. There is no humans without environment, and that you have to manage and look at the environment as one where humans, animals, environment, habitat all coexist.
Amazing. We get a lot of David Attenborough responses to that question, and it's hard not to say that.
It's hard not to love him. I mean, yeah. I mean, again, my picking one is, I would not call that a softball question. First of all, that's a hard question.
It definitely. I recently, for me, I've been watching a lot of Christina Figueres from Costa Rica, who was the lead negotiator for the Paris Agreement. She's just been blowing my mind. I feel like there's so many. I guess maybe it's not a softball. It's it'll get you thinking. So we got a few minutes left, Nick. What do we want? Would you love the public to know more about this issue? In general, you're like every man or every woman. How do you think we could affect them to get moving faster? If you had to pick up one or two different things.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it is, we all have a role to play, and we as individuals can have a real impact. It can't be individuals alone that are making the difference, but individuals, our voices matter, our actions matters. And it starts with us, and little changes at home to reduce our individual plastic waste footprint have huge collective impacts globally. And the example I always say, it's just one bag, it's just one straw, what does that matter? Taken collectively as a population of almost 8 billion globally every day, it does add up very quickly. So individual action, don't try and go plastic free overnight, right? Plastics are a great material, but think about what things in your daily life could you do without, or could you use an alternative product that may not be as hard to deal with when you're done with it? So that would be one. And then secondly, it would be just, understand what policies are in place, understand what recycling looks like in your community, understand what can be recycled, what can't, why is it the way it is, and then think about, again, taking the next step of engagement, talking with your elected officials and understanding what their views and positions are on materials management, on plastics, especially single-use plastics, and understanding how you might fit into that equation and be able to, encourage them to make decisions that are good for the planet, are good for people, and are good for the economy.
Well, Nick Mallos, we're super grateful to have you here on the SoulBuffalo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, my friend. We will attach the report to the final recording of this that we're going to put out to everyone. We have Kieran Smith from Mr. Green Africa in Nairobi is going to join us on Tuesday. And then next Thursday, we have Matt Prendeville, our friend from Upstream Solutions. So, and he is both of these guys are just chock full of. Do you know Kieran by chance?
I don't, but I will be tuning in. I'm intrigued. I know Matt, but I do not know Kieran, so I will be tuning in.
You got to meet him. He is running this incredible cooperative in Kenya, and essentially they had Paul Pullman from Unilever did a tour of his facility, and then 2 weeks later they had a deal with Unilever 4 years ago, and they were making PCR based dishwasher soap with Unilever, and he is just hundreds of people in Nairobi. This guy's just doing incredible things to help better their lives, like waste collector folks. So anyway, Nick, thank you so much. Thanks for your incredible work with the Ocean Plastic Scientist Dream Team that just put out this report. Super grateful for the work you're doing at Ocean Conservancy and Trash Free Seas. We're so grateful to have you guys as partners at the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network. So yeah, man, thank you so much for coming on. We'd love to have you back.
Be well, everyone. Appreciate you tuning in, and yeah, keep on keeping on.
All right, take it easy. Thanks.
Bye-bye.